I'm Sarah, 28 years old, and I have a younger brother named Jake, who's 24. Since childhood, he's been the golden boy of our family. When he wanted the latest gaming console, it magically appeared under the Christmas tree. When he crashed his first car from reckless driving, suddenly it became a learning experience, and Dad co-signed for an even better replacement. When his grades slipped in high school, it was always the curriculum being too challenging for his creative mind. Meanwhile, my reality was completely different. I worked 3 jobs throughout high school and college, tutoring kids after school, weekend shifts at a local diner, and summers doing data entry at an accounting firm. Every dollar I saved was scrutinized. Every achievement I earned was met with, "Well, you've always been the practical one, Sarah." I never received praise, just expectations. My role in the family was crystal clear. Work hard, stay quiet, and make sure Jake had everything he needed to reach his potential. The pattern established itself early. When Jake was 14 and wanted to attend an expensive summer film camp in California, my parents didn't have the money. But they looked at me expectantly, even though I was working double shifts at the diner just to save for my own college applications. "Sarah, you know how important this is for Jake's future," Mom said with that familiar, guilt-laden tone. "He has real talent, and this could open doors for him." So I handed over the $3,000 I'd been saving for months, watching my own dreams take a backseat to his aspirations. The next year, it was a new computer for his digital art projects, another $2,500 that came out of my college fund, then professional photography equipment because he decided filmmaking wasn't artistic enough. Each time, the justification was the same. Jake was special. Jake had potential. Jake deserved every opportunity to succeed. And each time, I was the one expected to fund these opportunities because I was responsible and practical. Code words for the family member whose dreams didn't matter as much as the golden boys. By the time I graduated high school, I'd contributed over $15,000 to various Jake-related expenses, while my own college prospects remained uncertain due to lack of funds. I remember sitting in the guidance counselor's office, explaining that I'd have to choose a less expensive school because my family couldn't afford the better options, while knowing exactly where that money had actually gone. The counselor looked sympathetic and suggested I apply for more scholarships, never knowing that I'd already given away my own college fund to support my brother's hobbies. College was a nightmare of financial juggling. While my classmates worried about midterms and social events, I worked 2 jobs and took out every loan I could qualify for. I ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I care to remember, wore the same 3 outfits rotated throughout the week, and declined every social invitation because I couldn't afford the luxury of friendship. Meanwhile, Jake was back home getting a brand new car for his 16th birthday and complaining that it wasn't the exact color he'd wanted. The irony wasn't lost on me when I'd come home for breaks and find Jake lounging around the house, playing video games on the expensive system I'd bought him, while my parents stressed about money. They'd look at me hopefully, waiting for me to offer to help with bills or contribute to whatever Jake's newest obsession required. It became an unspoken expectation that my part-time job earnings would supplement the household income, but only for Jake's benefit. When I needed money for textbooks or school supplies, I was reminded about the importance of budgeting and personal responsibility. After graduation, I threw myself into building my marketing agency with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy. But I was determined to create financial security for myself, to never again be in a position where I had to choose between my own needs and family expectations. I worked 16-hour days, lived in a studio apartment that was basically a closet with a window, and reinvested every penny back into the business. It took 3 years, but finally, I was making good money, enough to afford a decent apartment, reliable transportation, and the occasional luxury of ordering takeout instead of cooking. That's when Jake announced he'd been accepted to UCLA Film School, and the family dynamic I'd worked so hard to escape came roaring back with a vengeance. When Jake got accepted into UCLA for film school 2 years ago, the family dynamic remained unchanged, except now the stakes were much higher. He wanted the full college experience, prestigious private university, trendy apartment near campus, all the equipment a budding filmmaker could dream of. The only problem? Neither he nor our parents could afford any of it. That's when Dad approached me with his signature guilt-laden speech. "Sarah, you've built such a successful marketing agency," he said, gesturing around my modest but comfortable apartment. "You're doing well for yourself. Jake has this incredible opportunity, and we can't let him miss out because of money. You know how talented he is. This could change his whole life." I should have laughed. I should have reminded him that I'd clawed my way to every success I had, building my agency from nothing while living on ramen noodles and working 18-hour days. I should have pointed out that Jake had never held a job longer than 2 weeks, usually quitting because the work was beneath his artistic vision. But somewhere deep down, I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe if I helped him achieve his dreams, I'd finally get the recognition and appreciation I'd been craving my whole life. The conversation didn't end there, of course. Dad launched into a detailed explanation of why this investment in Jake's future was actually an investment in the whole family's success. He painted vivid pictures of Jake becoming the next big Hollywood director, thanking me in his Oscar acceptance speech, setting up the whole family for life with his inevitable success. Mom chimed in with stories of famous directors who'd started at UCLA, making it sound like acceptance there was practically a guarantee of future stardom. "Think about it, Sarah," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "When Jake makes it big, he'll remember who believed in him when it mattered most. This isn't just charity, it's believing in family. And when you have kids someday, wouldn't you want your family to support them the same way?" The emotional manipulation was masterful, layering guilt with hope and familial obligation. They weren't asking me to throw money away on Jake's whims. They were asking me to invest in a sure thing that would benefit everyone. They made it sound like I'd be selfish and short-sighted not to see the obvious wisdom in funding his education. So I opened my wallet. Again, I wrote the check for his first year's tuition, $58,000. Then came the apartment deposit and 6 months rent up front because his credit was non-existent, $14,000. The film equipment he insisted he needed to compete with his classmates, professional cameras, editing software, lighting rigs, another $12,000. Books, supplies, and a laptop powerful enough for video editing, $5,000. Before I knew it, I'd spent nearly $90,000 just to get him started. The equipment list was particularly galling. Jake presented it to me like a business proposal, complete with research on what other film students were using and explanations for why each item was essential to his success. He'd spent hours creating a PowerPoint presentation that broke down the cost per use ratio of professional cameras versus rental fees, making it sound like buying everything up front was actually the economical choice. "Look, Sarah," he'd said, clicking through slides filled with technical specifications and price comparisons. "If I rent this camera for every project, it'll cost way more in the long run. But if you buy it from me now, I'll use it throughout school and then when I start my career. It's really an investment that will pay for itself." His logic was compelling in the way that all good manipulation tends to be. There was enough truth in it to make the deception believable. And I wanted to believe it, wanted to think that this massive financial outlay was actually a smart business decision, rather than enabling behavior dressed up in fancy packaging. But it didn't stop there. Throughout his freshman year, the requests kept coming with clockwork regularity. Emergency grocery money because he'd spent his food budget on takeout with friends. Extra cash for networking events that turned out to be expensive dinners in Hollywood. Money to join the film club that required costly trips to festivals. Each time, Dad would call me with the same exhausted tone. "Sarah, he's struggling to fit in. These opportunities don't come twice, just this once." The networking events were particularly costly. Jake would call me in a panic, explaining that there was an industry mixer or film festival that could change his entire career trajectory, but he needed money for tickets, transportation, and appropriate clothing. "Everyone who's anyone in film will be there," he'd say breathlessly. "This could be my big break, but I can't show up looking like a student. I need to look professional." Each event required a new wardrobe, new business cards, and often expensive accommodations if it was out of town. The costs added up quickly. $500 here, $800 there, until I realized I was essentially funding Jake's social life under the guise of career development. When I'd ask him afterward what connections he'd made or opportunities he'd discovered, his answers were always vague and disappointing. "It's about building long-term relationships," he'd explain. "You can't expect immediate results from networking." The film club expenses were even more frustrating. What had initially been presented as a modest membership fee ballooned into costly trips to various film festivals across the country. Jake convinced me that these weren't vacations, but essential educational experiences that would expose him to cutting-edge filmmaking techniques and industry trends. "Sarah, this isn't a spring break trip," he'd insist when I questioned the $2,000 cost for a weekend in Austin for South by Southwest. "This is basically an extension of my coursework. All the professors recommend that serious film students attend these festivals. I'll be studying the latest independent films and meeting directors who could mentor me or offer me jobs after graduation." I'd reluctantly transfer the money, telling myself that I was investing in his education and future career prospects. But when Jake would post photos on social media from these trips, they looked suspiciously like vacation pictures. Him and his friends at expensive restaurants, concerts, and parties, with very little evidence of any serious filmmaking study taking place. By the end of his first year, I'd contributed another $25,000 in emergency expenses. When sophomore year rolled around, the pattern repeated with even more expensive demands. Tuition, rent, equipment upgrades, and a steady stream of unexpected costs that somehow always required my immediate financial intervention. The equipment upgrades were particularly galling. Apparently, the professional-grade camera I'd bought him the previous year was already outdated, and he needed the latest model to keep up with industry standards. "Technology moves so fast in filmmaking," Jake explained during one particularly expensive phone call. "The camera you bought me last year shoots in 4K, but now everyone's moving to 8K resolution. If I don't upgrade my equipment, my student films will look amateur compared to my classmates' work. Professors notice these things, Sarah. It could affect my grades and recommendations." The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Stay current with technology or fall behind. But the price tag for staying current was staggering. The new camera system cost $18,000, and that was just the beginning. It needed specialized lenses, memory cards, and accessories that added another $8,000 to the total. By the time Jake had upgraded all his equipment to match the new camera's capabilities, I'd spent more on his sophomore year gear than some people spend on cars. Junior year brought a new category of expenses: internship costs. Jake had landed what he described as an incredible opportunity to work as an unpaid intern at a small production company in Beverly Hills. The internship was unpaid, naturally, because it was such a prestigious learning experience, but it required him to dress professionally every day, maintain a car reliable enough for daily commuting to Beverly Hills, and attend industry events where he could network with the other interns and junior employees. This internship could lead to a job offer after graduation, Jake explained when he called, asking for money to lease a newer car. But I can't show up driving that beat-up Honda you helped me buy in high school. Everyone else has nice cars, and appearances matter in this industry. If I look like I can't afford to be there, people will assume I don't belong there. The car lease was $850 per month for a BMW that Jake insisted was the minimum acceptable vehicle for someone trying to make it in Hollywood. The professional wardrobe required another $3,000 because apparently film industry interns needed designer clothes to properly represent their companies. The networking events cost even more. $200 dinners where Jake would rub shoulders with other unpaid interns, all of them apparently convinced that spending money they didn't have was an essential investment in their futures. The internship lasted 6 months and resulted in exactly nothing. No job offer, no meaningful connections, no career advancement of any kind. When I asked Jake what he'd learned from the experience, he gave me vague answers about understanding the industry and building relationships that would pay off later. The only concrete result was that I'd spent nearly $15,000 subsidizing his opportunity to work for free. But Jake always had explanations for why his investments in his future hadn't yet paid off. The internship hadn't led to a job because the company was going through budget cuts, not because his performance was lacking. The networking events hadn't resulted in concrete opportunities because the film industry operated on longer timelines than other businesses. Relationships took years to mature into actual job offers. The expensive equipment hadn't dramatically improved his grades because his professors were biased against students who had access to better gear than the school provided. Senior year arrived with the promise that all these investments would finally start paying dividends. Jake's thesis film project would showcase all the skills he developed and equipment he'd accumulated over the previous 3 years. Industry professionals would see his work and recognize his talent. Job offers would pour in, and my financial support would finally transition from expense to investment return. The thesis project, naturally, required additional funding. Jake needed to hire actors, rent locations, and pay for post-production services that weren't included in his tuition. The budget he presented to me was $12,000, which he insisted was actually quite modest for a film of the quality he was planning to produce. "Sarah, this is my audition reel for the entire film industry," he explained with the gravity of someone discussing nuclear disarmament. "Every director, producer, and agent who sees this film will judge my potential based on its quality. I can't afford to cut corners now, not after everything we've invested in getting me to this point. This film is literally my ticket to Hollywood success." The budget breakdown was impressive in its detail and depressing in its cost. Actor payments, location fees, equipment rentals, catering for the crew, post-production editing, sound mixing, color correction, and film festival submission fees. Each line item was justified with explanations about industry standards and professional expectations. Jake had clearly spent considerable time researching what a real film production required, and he wasn't willing to accept anything less than professional quality for his student project. I funded the thesis film, of course, bringing my total investment in Jake's education to over $200,000. The final product was technically competent, but utterly forgettable, a pretentious short film about alienation in modern society that managed to be both derivative and incomprehensible. Jake was enormously proud of it, submitting it to dozens of film festivals and confidently predicting that it would launch his career into the stratosphere. The film was rejected by every festival Jake submitted it to, including several that were specifically designed for student work. The rejection letters, when they bothered to send them, were form responses that offered no feedback about why the film hadn't been selected. Jake's professors gave it a B+, praising its technical execution, while noting that the story felt somewhat familiar and could have benefited from more original perspectives. But Jake, ever the optimist, insisted that the lack of immediate recognition was just a temporary setback. The film industry was notoriously difficult to break into, he reminded me, and many famous directors had faced similar rejections early in their careers. His thesis film would find its audience eventually, and when it did, all the industry professionals who had overlooked it would regret their short-sightedness. The total climbed past $200,000, but I told myself it was an investment in his future. Surely once he graduated and started his career, he'd appreciate everything I'd sacrificed for him. I'd calculated that the amount I'd spent on Jake's education could have been a down payment on a beautiful house, or seed money for expanding my business into new markets, or a comfortable retirement fund. But instead, I'd chosen to invest in my brother's dreams, trusting that his success would ultimately vindicate the sacrifice. Then, 3 months before his graduation, Jake called me with his most outrageous demand yet. "Sarah, I need you to buy me a Porsche 911 as my graduation gift," he said, as casually as if he were asking me to pick up milk from the store. "All the successful film guys in LA drive them, right? It's about image and making connections. If I show up to meetings in some beat-up Honda, nobody's going to take me seriously." I actually laughed out loud. The audacity of the request was so overwhelming that my initial response was genuine amusement. Here was my brother, who had never earned a dollar from his filmmaking, despite my massive investment in his education, demanding that I buy him a $90,000 car so he could look successful enough to convince other people to give him work. "Jake, I've already spent over $200,000 on your education. A graduation gift? How about the degree I paid for?" His tone shifted immediately, becoming cold and manipulative in a way that reminded me of our father. "Look, Sarah, you've invested all this money in my future, right? Well, this car is part of that investment. I've already told people you're getting it for me. If you back out now, it's going to be humiliating. Plus, I've been thinking, if you don't get me the car, I don't really see the point in having you at my graduation. I mean, what's the point of having family there who don't really support your success?" The shift from request to threat was so smooth that it took me a moment to process what had just happened. Jake had progressed from asking for a favor to demanding compliance, and when I'd hesitated, he'd immediately resorted to emotional blackmail. The implicit message was clear: buy me this car or lose your place in this family milestone. But the manipulation didn't end there. Jake continued talking, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had clearly rehearsed this conversation multiple times. "Think about it logically, Sarah. You've spent all this money on my education, but education is just the foundation. Now I need the tools to actually build a career on that foundation. In the film industry, perception is reality. If I look successful, people will assume I am successful, and that assumption becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if I show up to meetings looking like I can't afford to belong there, people will write me off before I even open my mouth." He'd clearly put considerable thought into this argument, layering practical considerations with emotional appeals and veiled threats. The Porsche wasn't a luxury. It was a business necessity. I wasn't being asked to indulge his materialism. I was being invited to complete my investment in his future success. And if I refused, I wasn't just declining to buy him a car. I was abandoning him at the crucial moment when my support could make the difference between his success and failure. "I've already been networking with people in the industry," Jake continued, "and when they ask what I'm driving after graduation, I tell them my sister is getting me a Porsche. They're impressed, Sarah. They see that I have family support, that I come from success, and that changes how they treat me. But if I have to go back and tell them that actually, my sister decided not to follow through, it's going to be humiliating. People will think I was lying about my family's support, and that kind of reputation damage could follow me for years." The audacity hit me like a physical blow. Not only was Jake demanding that I buy him a luxury car, but he was claiming that he'd already committed me to the purchase in his conversations with industry contacts. He'd put me in a position where refusing his demand would supposedly damage his professional reputation, making me responsible not just for the car, but for the consequences of his presumptuous promises. But what came next was even worse. Dad called me that evening, his voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment I'd heard so many times growing up. "Sarah, Jake told me about your conversation. I have to say, I'm surprised at you. After everything you've invested in his education, you're going to let him down over a car? He's worked so hard, and he deserves to start his career on the right foot. Don't be selfish now." That word, selfish, echoed in my head all night. Selfish? After spending my 20s funding his dreams instead of investing in my own business expansion? After covering every expense while he partied his way through college without working a single job? After sacrificing vacations, delaying buying my own home, and putting my own life on hold so he could reach his potential? Dad continued his guilt trip with the skills of someone who had perfected the technique over decades of practice. "You know, Sarah, family is about sacrifice. Your mother and I made sacrifices for both of you kids, and we never kept score or demanded gratitude. That's what families do. They support each other through thick and thin. Jake has this incredible opportunity to make something of himself, and all he needs is a little more support to get over the finish line." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Dad cycling through every guilt-inducing argument in his repertoire. He reminded me of all the times the family had supported me, though he couldn't cite any specific examples. He talked about how proud he was of my success and how that success came with responsibilities to help other family members achieve their own dreams. He painted a picture of Jake struggling to break into a competitive industry while his own sister refused to give him the tools he needed to succeed. Think about how you'll feel if Jake's career never takes off because he couldn't make the right impression on the people who matter, Dad said, his voice heavy with manufactured sadness. You'll always wonder if things might have been different if you'd just helped him this one last time. Is saving money really worth potentially destroying your brother's future? But perhaps most manipulatively, Dad framed the car purchase as a loan rather than a gift. Look, if you're worried about the money, think of it as a loan. Once Jake starts making good money in the film industry, he can pay you back. You're not throwing money away. You're making a short-term investment that will be repaid with interest once his career takes off. This reframing was particularly insidious because it addressed my practical concerns while ignoring the underlying problem. The issue wasn't really whether I could afford to buy Jake a Porsche. It was that he felt entitled to demand one. But by presenting the purchase as a temporary loan that would be repaid, Dad was trying to make my refusal seem like a lack of faith in Jake's eventual success rather than a reasonable boundary against unreasonable demands. The call ended with Dad expressing his disappointment in my selfishness and his hope that I would do the right thing before it was too late. He hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone with the weight of family expectations and the growing realization that no amount of sacrifice would ever be enough to satisfy their demands. That's when it hit me. No matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. I could liquidate my entire business, hand him everything I owned, and he'd still find something else to demand. The pattern would never end, because in their minds, I wasn't Jake's sister. I was his personal ATM, existing solely to fund his dreams and ambitions, without any consideration for my own needs or desires. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't really about a car at all. This was about power and control, about maintaining a family dynamic where my role was to give, and Jake's role was to take. The Porsche demand was just the latest escalation in a pattern that had been established in childhood and reinforced through years of my compliance. I didn't argue with Dad. I didn't try to explain the years of sacrifice or the mounting financial strain. I didn't even bother reminding him that I'd already paid for an entire college education that most families spend decades paying off. Instead, I hung up and spent the next hour making phone calls that would change everything. I called UCLA's financial aid office and informed them that I would no longer be covering Jake's expenses, effective immediately. The financial aid officer seemed confused by my request. Apparently, it was unusual for family members to withdraw their support so close to graduation, but she dutifully noted my instructions in Jake's file. I contacted his landlord and terminated the lease agreement that I'd been guaranteeing. The landlord was more concerned about the practical implications, asking whether Jake would be able to cover the rent himself going forward. I explained that he'd need to work that out independently, as I was no longer financially responsible for his housing costs. I called the bank and stopped all automatic payments I'd set up for his various accounts: his car lease, his credit card minimum payments, his gym membership, and the dozen other small expenses that I'd been covering without really thinking about them. Each call required me to verify my identity and explain that I was voluntarily terminating my financial responsibility, something the customer service representatives seemed to find unusual enough to require supervisory approval. Most importantly, I informed the bursar's office that if there were any outstanding balances on Jake's account, they should contact him directly, as I was no longer financially responsible. The bursar's office staff member explained that Jake would need to either pay any outstanding balances himself or set up payment plans directly with the university. The timing was perfect in the most devastating way possible. Jake was 3 months away from graduation, with one final semester's tuition due, and his thesis film project requiring additional equipment rentals. Without my financial backing, his carefully constructed college fantasy was about to crumble. Each phone call felt like removing another support beam from a structure that had been entirely dependent on my financial foundation. The house of cards I'd been propping up for 4 years was about to collapse, and for the first time, I wasn't going to be there to clean up the debris. I spent that weekend in complete peace, working in my garden and catching up on reading I'd been putting off for months. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from Jake and Dad, but I ignored every single one. I knew the chaos was building somewhere else, but for the first time in years, it wasn't my problem to solve. The silence was intoxicating. Without the constant background stress of managing Jake's financial crises, I felt like I could finally breathe deeply. I realized that for years, I'd been carrying a low-level anxiety about when the next expensive emergency would arise, when the next desperate phone call would come, asking me to solve another problem that Jake had created through his irresponsibility. By Monday morning, the reality had set in. Jake's tuition payment had bounced, triggering an automatic hold on his student account that prevented him from attending classes or accessing university resources. His rent check was returned for insufficient funds, initiating eviction proceedings that would require him to either pay immediately or vacate the apartment within 30 days. The equipment rental company was demanding payment for thousands of dollars worth of gear he'd charged to my business credit card, threatening legal action if the balance wasn't settled within a week. His entire final semester was in jeopardy, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk. Dad called me first, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Sarah, what have you done? Jake's semester is falling apart. The school is threatening to prevent him from graduating. You can't just abandon him 3 months before he finishes." "Watch me," I replied calmly. Jake made it very clear that unless I buy him a Porsche, I'm not welcome in his life. Well, if I'm not family enough to attend his graduation, then I'm not family enough to fund it either. But he didn't mean it. He was just stressed about starting his career. You can't throw away 4 years of investment over a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Dad. It was an ultimatum, and I chose to call his bluff. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, with Dad cycling through every guilt-inducing argument he could think of. He accused me of being vindictive and cruel, of destroying Jake's future out of spite, of abandoning family when they needed me most. He reminded me of every time he claimed the family had supported me, though the examples remained frustratingly vague, and he painted vivid pictures of Jake's devastation and the long-term consequences of my selfishness. "You're destroying everything we've worked for," Dad said, his voice cracking with emotion. "All those years of sacrifice, all that money invested in Jake's education, and you're going to throw it all away because he asked for one more thing? How can you be so heartless?" But I remained unmoved. Years of conditioning had made me susceptible to these guilt trips, but the Porsche demand had been so outrageous that it had finally broken through my trained responses. I could see the manipulation clearly now, and it no longer had power over me. The call ended with him screaming that I was destroying Jake's future out of spite, but I felt nothing but relief. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't being guilted into solving someone else's problems with my checkbook. Jake's panicked voicemail messages started arriving within hours, and the progression was almost predictable in its desperation. At first, they were angry, accusing me of sabotaging him out of jealousy and threatening to cut me out of his life permanently if I didn't reverse course immediately. "Sarah, I can't believe you're doing this to me," his first message began. "After everything I've worked for, after all the time and effort I've put into my education, you're going to destroy it all because you're jealous of my success? This is insane. You need to call the school right now and fix this, or I swear I'll never speak to you again." But as the day wore on and the full scope of his financial crisis became clear, his tone shifted to desperate pleading. The anger gave way to panic as he realized that his threats had no power over someone who was no longer willing to be manipulated by them. "Okay, Sarah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean what I said about the graduation. I was just stressed, and I said things I didn't mean. Please, you have to help me. I'm so close to graduating, and if you don't help me now, everything we've invested is going to be wasted. I promise I'll never ask for anything again. Just please don't let me lose everything when I'm so close to finishing." By evening, he was sobbing into the phone, his voice barely coherent through the tears. "Sarah, I'm begging you. I'll do anything you want. I'll get a job. I'll pay you back. I'll never mention the car again. But please don't let me lose my degree. I can't start over now. I don't know what I'll do if I can't graduate. Please, you're my sister. You're supposed to help me." The desperation in his voice was genuinely heartbreaking, but it was also illuminating. This was the first time in Jake's adult life that he was facing real consequences for his actions, and he was completely unprepared for the experience. He'd been shielded from reality for so long that he had no coping mechanisms for dealing with adversity that couldn't be solved by someone else's money. But it was too late. The damage was done, and more importantly, I'd finally seen him clearly. The entitled, manipulative person he'd become wasn't an accident or a phase. It was who he truly was when he thought he could get away with it. The tears and promises were just another form of manipulation, deployed when threats and guilt trips had failed to achieve the desired result. The fallout was swift and merciless. Without my financial support, Jake couldn't afford his final semester's tuition, and UCLA's policies were inflexible. Students with outstanding balances weren't allowed to attend classes, use university facilities, or receive their degrees until all accounts were settled in full. Jake had 2 weeks to either pay the $58,000 he owed or withdraw from the program entirely. He scrambled desperately, applying for emergency loans, but his complete lack of credit history and employment record made him ineligible for anything substantial. He'd spent 4 years living off my money without building any financial credentials of his own, and now that oversight was coming back to haunt him. Banks wanted to see proof of income, employment history, and creditworthiness, none of which Jake could provide. He begged our parents to co-sign for loans, but Dad's credit was already stretched thin from years of his own financial mismanagement and questionable decisions. The family's pattern of living beyond their means and relying on my bailouts had left everyone in a precarious financial position. Mom worked part-time at a retail store, making barely above minimum wage. Hardly the kind of income that would convince banks to approve large educational loans. Jake's desperation led him to increasingly pathetic attempts to raise money. He started a crowdfunding campaign titled, "Help Me Finish Film School. So close to my dreams." The description painted him as a victim of unexpected family circumstances, conveniently omitting the fact that I'd been funding his entire education and that his crisis stemmed from demanding a luxury car as a graduation gift. The campaign page was filled with manipulative language designed to tug at heartstrings and wallets. Jake wrote about his lifelong dream of becoming a filmmaker, his years of hard work in school, and the unexpected family emergency that had left him unable to complete his final semester. He posted photos of himself in his film production classes, looking serious and dedicated, with captions about how close he was to achieving his goals. But the campaign was a disaster from the start. Film school classmates who knew he'd been living lavishly while claiming financial hardship were quick to call him out in the comments section. People who'd watched him brag about expensive equipment purchases and Hollywood networking events questioned why he suddenly needed money when he'd been flashing cash for years. Wait, isn't this the same guy who was bragging about his new $20,000 camera setup last month? One former classmate commented. And didn't you just lease that BMW? Maybe sell some of that expensive equipment if you really need tuition money. Another classmate was even more direct. I've seen Jake at every expensive restaurant in West Hollywood for the past 2 years. He's been telling everyone that his sister is loaded and pays for everything. Now he's claiming financial hardship? This seems pretty sketchy. The few family members who donated small amounts out of sympathy or obligation were quickly outnumbered by former friends sharing stories of his entitled behavior and casual spending habits. Extended relatives began commenting with their own memories of Jake's demanding behavior at family gatherings, his complaints about gifts not being expensive enough, and his casual assumptions that other people would always pay his way. After 2 weeks, his crowdfunding had raised exactly $347, not even enough to cover his textbooks, let alone the $58,000 he needed for tuition. The campaign was eventually reported for misleading information by multiple classmates who provided evidence of Jake's actual financial situation. And the platform shut it down, refunding the few donations that had been made. The public failure of his fundraising attempt added humiliation to Jake's growing list of problems. Screenshots of his campaign and the brutal comments it had received circulated among his social circles, cementing his reputation as someone who had been living beyond his means while deceiving people about his circumstances. Meanwhile, his apartment situation deteriorated rapidly. Without rent payments, his landlord began eviction proceedings according to California state law. Jake's roommates, who'd been enjoying the upscale apartment I'd been subsidizing without knowing it, turned on him quickly when they realized they'd have to cover his portion of the rent or find somewhere else to live. We had no idea his sister was paying for everything, one roommate told mutual friends. Jake always acted like he had money, buying rounds at bars and talking about his trust fund. Now, we find out he's broke and we're supposed to cover his $2,000 share of the rent? Hell no. The roommate drama played out on social media, with Jake's former friends posting about how they'd been deceived about his financial situation and expressing their anger at being stuck with additional expenses because of his lies. The friend group that had surrounded him during his flush college years evaporated as soon as his financial situation became clear. Jake found himself not only broke, but socially isolated, with former friends actively avoiding him and warning others about his tendency to manipulate people into paying his expenses. The carefully constructed image he'd maintained for 4 years crumbled in a matter of weeks, leaving him with no money, no friends, and no prospects for salvaging his final semester. The thesis film project, the culmination of his 4 years of study and my massive financial investment, became impossible to complete without the equipment he could no longer afford to rent. His professors, sympathetic but practical, explained that without a finished thesis project, he couldn't graduate even if he somehow managed to pay his outstanding tuition balance. Jake, I understand you're going through a difficult situation, his thesis advisor told him during what would be their final meeting. But the thesis film is a degree requirement, not an optional assignment. Without it, there's no path to graduation, regardless of your financial circumstances. Perhaps you should consider taking a leave of absence and completing your degree when your situation stabilizes. But taking a leave of absence would mean starting over with his thesis project, losing the momentum he'd built, and essentially adding another year to his college experience. More importantly, it would mean admitting defeat and acknowledging that his entitled behavior had consequences he couldn't manipulate his way out of. Jake's Hollywood dreams, built entirely on my financial foundation, collapsed like a house of cards. The networking connections he'd boasted about proved to be shallow acquaintanceships that evaporated as soon as his financial support disappeared. Industry professionals who had tolerated his presence at expensive events because they assumed he had money backing him suddenly stopped returning his calls and emails. 3 weeks after I cut off funding, Jake was back in Phoenix, living in his childhood bedroom at our parents' house. The prestigious UCLA film student who had been planning his Oscar acceptance speech was reduced to a college dropout with massive debt and no degree to show for it. The contrast was startling. From living in a trendy LA apartment to sleeping under a faded Star Wars poster in the same room he'd occupied as a teenager. The physical regression to his childhood environment seemed to break something in Jake's psyche. He spent most days lying in bed, scrolling through social media, and seeing his former classmates posting about their upcoming graduation, their job interviews, and their successful thesis film screenings. The life he'd expected to have was continuing without him, while he was trapped in an adolescent bedroom in Phoenix, unemployed and directionless. Dad was furious, oscillating between blaming me for destroying Jake's future and desperately trying to convince me to reconsider. He called me daily with new arguments. Jake had learned his lesson. He'd never ask for anything again. I was throwing away my own investment. The family would never forgive me if I didn't fix this situation. But something interesting happened during those conversations. The more Dad talked, the more he revealed about Jake's behavior that I'd never known about. In his desperation to convince me to resume funding Jake's education, he began sharing details that he thought would make me more sympathetic, but actually had the opposite effect. Apparently, Jake had been telling his classmates that his trust fund sister was funding his lifestyle, describing me not as a supportive family member, but as his personal financial resource. He'd bragged about having a built-in safety net that would always catch him, no matter what risks he took or how irresponsibly he behaved. He'd even joked to friends that he'd trained me to respond to financial emergencies by making me feel guilty about his missed opportunities. He didn't mean it the way it sounds, Dad insisted when he saw my reaction to these revelations. He's just young, and he was trying to impress friends, is Ferris? You know how kids that age exaggerate to make themselves look important. He really does appreciate everything you've done for him, even if he doesn't always express it the right way. But these revelations, meant to convince me that Jake was just young and stupid rather than malicious, had the opposite effect. They showed me that his entitlement wasn't accidental. It was calculated. He'd been deliberately manipulating my love and sense of family responsibility for years, viewing me not as his sister, but as a resource to be exploited. The training comment was particularly galling. It suggested that Jake saw our relationship as a game where he pulled emotional levers to get desired financial responses. My years of sacrifice and support hadn't been appreciated as generous gestures from a loving sister. They'd been cataloged as successful manipulation techniques that could be repeated and escalated over time. Mom, who'd always been more passive in family dynamics, surprised everyone by taking Jake's side aggressively. She accused me of being cruel and vindictive, claiming that successful people had a responsibility to help their family members achieve their own dreams. She insisted that Jake's demand for the car had been a moment of poor judgment that I was blowing out of proportion. "He's your baby brother, Sarah," she pleaded during one particularly emotional call. "He made a mistake, but you're punishing him like he committed some terrible crime. All he wanted was help starting his career. Is it really worth destroying our family over a car?" Her framing of the situation was infuriating and revealing. In her version of events, I was the villain for refusing to buy Jake a Porsche, not the victim of years of financial manipulation and emotional blackmail. She conveniently ignored the $200,000 I'd already spent, the years of sacrifice I'd made, or the ultimatum he delivered about my graduation invitation. To her, family meant I should give until it hurt, then give more. My success created obligations, not opportunities. My achievements were family resources, not personal accomplishments. The idea that I might have my own dreams, needs, or boundaries was apparently selfish and unfamiliar. "You know, Sarah, when I was your age, family came first," she continued, her voice taking on the sanctimonious tone that had driven me crazy throughout my childhood. "We didn't keep score or demand gratitude. We just helped each other, because that's what families do. I'm disappointed that you've become so focused on money that you can't see what really matters." The irony was overwhelming. Here was a woman who had consistently prioritized Jake's wants over my needs, demanding that I sacrifice my financial security for his luxury purchases, and she was lecturing me about the importance of family and the irrelevance of money. She was asking me to bankrupt myself for Jake's benefit, while simultaneously criticizing me for caring about money. The extended family response was deeply divided, creating schisms that would permanently alter family relationships. Some relatives sided with my parents, viewing my decision as harsh and unforgiving. They argued that family should support each other unconditionally, and that I was being petty by holding Jake's words against him. These family members began treating me coolly at gatherings, making pointed comments about loyalty and forgiveness. Aunt Linda started every conversation with passive-aggressive remarks about how some people put money before family. Uncle Tom would make jokes about successful people who forgot where they came from and abandoned their relatives in times of need. The criticism stung, especially coming from people whose approval I'd always valued. But I began to realize that many of these relatives had their own entitled family members they were enabling, and my decision to stop funding Jake's lifestyle threatened their own dysfunctional dynamics. If I could successfully establish boundaries against unreasonable demands, it might inspire other family members to question why they were sacrificing themselves for relatives who showed no appreciation. But others saw the situation differently. My Aunt Patricia, who'd watched the dynamic for years, privately told me she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. She revealed that she and other relatives had been discussing Jake's behavior for some time, worried about how my parents' enabling was affecting both of us. We all knew this was going to happen eventually. Patricia confided during a family barbecue where Jake was notably absent. "Jake's been raised to believe the world owes him everything, and you've been trained to provide it. Someone had to break the cycle, and I'm glad it was you who found the strength to do it." She went on to share stories I'd never heard about Jake's behavior at family events, his complaints when gifts weren't expensive enough, his assumption that other people would always pay for his meals and entertainment, his casual dismissal of anyone who couldn't contribute to his lifestyle, Apparently, the entitled behavior I'd been enabling at home was also on full display in extended family settings. Last Christmas, Jake actually complained to me that the gift card I gave him was only for $50, Patricia told me. He said he'd seen something he wanted that cost $200, and he hoped I could help him out with the difference. When I said no, he pouted for the rest of the evening and barely spoke to me. Who does that? Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. For so long, I'd wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe I really was being selfish and cruel like my parents claimed. But hearing from relatives who'd observed the situation objectively confirmed what I'd finally realized. I wasn't responsible for managing Jake's life, even if our parents had convinced us both that I was. Meanwhile, Jake's adjustment to reality was painful to watch, even from a distance. He'd spent 4 years living like a Hollywood insider, networking with industry professionals, and developing an identity built entirely on potential rather than achievement. Now, back in Phoenix, with no degree, no connections, and no financial resources, he was forced to confront the gap between his aspirations and his actual qualifications. The psychological adjustment was brutal. Jake had constructed his entire identity around being a future filmmaker, someone destined for greatness who just needed the right opportunities to showcase his talent. Living in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of his adolescence, forced him to confront the possibility that he might be just another young man with expensive tastes and no practical skills. He spent weeks in a depressive spiral, rarely leaving his room except to grab food from the kitchen. His social media presence, once filled with carefully curated images of film sets and industry events, went completely dark. The contrast between his former online persona, confident, successful, connected, and his current reality was too stark to maintain the illusion. Dad tried to convince Jake to apply to other schools to finish his degree, but the financial reality made that impossible. Jake owed UCLA nearly $60,000 in unpaid tuition and fees, and no other institution would accept his credits or allow him to enroll while those debts remained outstanding. Even community colleges required proof that previous educational debts had been resolved before allowing new students to register. After 2 months of unemployment and isolation, Jake eventually found work at a local electronics store, the same kind of retail job he'd scorned throughout high school and college. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the family. Here was the young man who'd insisted he needed a Porsche to make the right impression in Hollywood, now asking customers if they wanted extended warranties on their television purchases. The job was a harsh introduction to the realities that most people face in their early 20s. Jake had to wake up early, follow a schedule set by someone else, deal with difficult customers, and perform tasks that he found boring and beneath his artistic sensibilities. The paycheck barely covered his car insurance and the minimum payments on credit cards he'd maxed out during his college years. His co-workers, most of whom were also in their 20s and working retail while pursuing other goals, quickly became annoyed with Jake's attitude. He complained constantly about the work being temporary and made it clear that he considered himself above the job. His references to his film school background and his real career plans came across as pretentious and out of touch. He acts like he's slumming it with us common people, one coworker told a mutual acquaintance. Like this job is just a brief detour before he becomes the next Spielberg. But he's been here 6 months and he still doesn't know how to work the register properly. Maybe focus on doing this job well instead of complaining about how it's beneath you. The reality of minimum wage work was a shock to someone who'd spent 4 years living off someone else's money without any understanding of its value. Jake had never had to budget carefully, never had to choose between paying bills and buying food, never had to worry about whether his car would pass inspection or whether he could afford to replace worn-out shoes. But true to his character, Jake didn't accept responsibility gracefully. Instead, he doubled down on his victim narrative, telling anyone who'd listen that his sister had sabotaged his dreams out of jealousy. He spun elaborate stories about how I'd been planning to destroy his career from the beginning, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the rug out from under him. According to Jake's revised version of history, I had always been jealous of his creativity and potential. My financial support hadn't been generous. It had been controlling, designed to make him dependent so I could feel important. When he'd finally asserted his independence by making reasonable requests about his career needs, I'd shown my true colors by cutting off support out of spite. Sarah couldn't stand that I was going to be successful, Jake would tell anyone who'd listen. She spent all those years playing the martyr, acting like she was doing me these huge favors, but really she was just trying to control me. The second I stood up for myself and asked for what I needed to succeed, she decided to destroy everything out of jealousy. These stories might have gained traction if they weren't so easily disproven. Too many people knew the truth about my years of financial support and Jake's outrageous final demand. Extended family members who'd watched me sacrifice my own goals to fund his education weren't fooled by his revisionist history. Former classmates who'd witnessed his entitlement firsthand began sharing their own stories, painting a clear picture of someone who'd been given every opportunity and squandered them through arrogance. Social media posts from his UCLA days resurfaced, showing Jake bragging about expensive purchases and exotic trips, all funded by money he demanded from me under various pretenses. I remember Jake telling everyone that his sister was obsessed with helping him succeed. One former classmate posted on Facebook. He said she got off on feeling important by funding his lifestyle. Now he's claiming she was jealous and controlling? Dude, she paid for everything while you partied for 4 years, and then you demanded she buy you a Porsche. Own your mistakes. The social media posts were particularly damaging because they provided concrete evidence of Jake's entitled behavior and his casual dismissal of my sacrifices. Screenshots of his posts about expensive equipment purchases, Hollywood networking events, and luxury experiences circulated among extended family and former friends, making it impossible for him to maintain his victim narrative. But Jake's capacity for self-deception proved remarkably resilient. Even when confronted with evidence of his own words and behavior, he found ways to reframe every situation to maintain his position as the wronged party. The expensive equipment purchases became necessary investments in his education. The networking events became professional obligations. The luxury experiences became industry requirements for building credibility. The breaking point came 8 months after his return to Phoenix, during a family dinner where Jake had been building toward a dramatic confrontation all evening. He'd been drinking throughout the meal, which always made his filter disappear completely, and finally exploded into a rant that would permanently alter our family relationships. The evening had started tensely, with Jake making pointed comments about family loyalty and support. He criticized relatives who abandoned ship when things got tough, and made sarcastic references to people who forgot where they came from once they became successful. The extended family members present grew increasingly uncomfortable as it became clear that Jake was working up to a major confrontation. You know what the problem is with this family? Jake finally exploded, standing at the head of the dinner table and pointing an accusatory finger at me, while our parents and relatives sat in stunned silence. Everyone acts like Sarah is some kind of saint, but she destroyed my life because I asked for one thing after giving her years to feel important by helping me. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Dad, who'd been defending Jake for months, seemed stunned by the raw entitlement in his words. The idea that I'd somehow been the beneficiary of our arrangement, that I'd enjoyed years of financial strain because it made me feel important, was so divorced from reality that even his staunchest supporters couldn't defend it. But Jake wasn't finished. The alcohol and months of resentment had loosened his tongue completely, and he continued his rant with increasing venom and decreasing coherence. She got off on being needed, and the second I didn't bow down and worship her for it, she decided to ruin everything. I gave her purpose. I gave her a reason to feel useful. And when I finally tried to set some boundaries and ask for what I deserved, she showed her true colors. The psychological projection was staggering. In Jake's mind, he had been doing me a favor by accepting my financial support, giving me opportunities to feel valuable and needed. My refusal to buy him a Porsche wasn't about reasonable boundaries. It was about my inability to handle his growing independence and success. You all need to choose sides here, Howdy. Jake continued, his voice rising with desperation and anger. Either you support family members who are trying to build something meaningful with their lives, or you enable selfish people who tear others down out of jealousy. Because that's what this is really about. Sarah can't stand that I was going to be more successful than her. The extended family members present exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly horrified by Jake's public meltdown and his attempts to force them into taking sides in what should have been a private family matter. Several relatives quietly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, unwilling to be part of the toxic drama that Jake was determined to create. Uncle Tom, who'd been one of Jake's supporters earlier in the conflict, finally spoke up with a tone of disgusted disappointment. Jake, you need to stop. Right now, you're embarrassing yourself and making everyone uncomfortable. Whatever issues you have with Sarah, this isn't the way to handle them. But Jake, too drunk and angry to read the room, doubled down on his aggressive approach. No, I'm not going to stop. I'm tired of everyone pretending that Sarah is the victim here when she's the one who destroyed my future out of spite. You all know what she did was wrong, but you're too afraid to call her out because she has money. The accusation that family members were only supporting me out of financial self-interest was the final straw for several relatives who'd been trying to remain neutral. Aunt Patricia stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. That's enough, Jake, she said firmly. You're talking about your sister like she's some kind of monster when everyone in this room knows she's been supporting you financially for years. She paid for your entire college education, and instead of being grateful, you demanded she buy you a luxury car. Now you're having a public tantrum because there were finally consequences for your behavior. Jake turned his fury toward Patricia, apparently believing that attacking her would somehow strengthen his position. Oh, so now you're going to lecture me about gratitude? Where were you when I needed help finishing school? Where was your support when my own sister decided to sabotage my career? Your sister didn't sabotage your career, Patricia shot back. You did that all by yourself when you decided that receiving $200,000 in education funding wasn't enough, and you demanded a Porsche on top of it. That's not Sarah being unsupportive. That's you being spoiled and entitled. The argument escalated quickly, with Jake becoming increasingly belligerent and other family members either joining Patricia's criticism or quietly leaving the gathering entirely. Mom tried unsuccessfully to calm things down, while Dad sat in stunned silence, apparently finally seeing Jake's behavior clearly for the first time. I stood up calmly during the chaos, gathered my purse, and walked toward the door. The shouting continued behind me as Jake argued with multiple relatives simultaneously, his voice becoming more shrill and desperate as he realized he was losing every ally he'd hoped to rally to his cause. As I reached the threshold, I turned back to address the room one final time, my voice cutting through the noise and bringing sudden silence. Jake, you're right about one thing. I did get something out of helping you all these years. I got to learn exactly who you really are. And now that I know, I'll never make the mistake of forgetting it. I left without another word, and I haven't been back since. The aftermath of that dinner marked the final fracture in our family relationships, but it also provided clarity that had been missing for months. Dad, embarrassed by Jake's public meltdown and perhaps finally seeing the situation clearly, stopped calling to plead Jake's case. The explosive argument had revealed aspects of Jake's character that even his most devoted supporters couldn't defend or rationalize away. Mom continued to reach out occasionally, but her appeals became weaker and less frequent as time passed. She seemed to understand, even if she couldn't admit it openly, that Jake's behavior that night had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The public humiliation of watching her son attack family members who'd been trying to help him had shattered some of her illusions about his character. Jake himself disappeared from family functions entirely. So, too ashamed to face relatives who'd witnessed his outburst and been personally attacked by him during his drunken rant. The few family members who might have been willing to maintain relationships with him were alienated by his aggressive behavior and his attempts to force them into choosing sides in a conflict that should have remained private. The few updates I received about Jake's situation came through my Aunt Patricia, who reported that his employment history continued to be problematic. He'd been fired from the electronics store for showing up late repeatedly and arguing with customers who complained about his attitude. The pattern repeated at subsequent retail jobs, initial employment followed by escalating conflicts with supervisors and coworkers until termination became inevitable. He just can't accept that he's special. Patricia told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings, every job he gets, he acts like he's doing them a favor by working there. He talks about his film school background like it qualifies him to manage the place, and he gets angry when people treat him like any other entry-level employee. His social circle had shrunk to virtually nothing, as former friends grew tired of his constant complaining and victim mentality. The classmates who'd enjoyed his funded lifestyle during college had no interest in associating with him, now that he was just another struggling 20-something with no prospects and a bad attitude. His dating life was similarly barren, which seemed to particularly frustrate someone who'd always expected things to come easily to him. Women in their 20s, it turned out, weren't particularly impressed by men who lived with their parents, worked sporadic retail jobs, and spent most conversations complaining about how unfairly life had treated them. He went on a few dates through dating apps, Patricia reported, but they never led to second dates. One woman told a mutual friend that Jake spent the entire dinner talking about how his family had sabotaged his film career and how he was too good for Phoenix. She said it was like listening to a teenager complain about his parents, except he was 25 years old. But perhaps the most telling detail was Jake's continued resentment and his complete inability to learn from his experiences. Even after losing everything, his education, his career prospects, his social circle, and most of his family relationships, Jake never acknowledged that his demand for the Porsche had been unreasonable or that his behavior had contributed to his problems. In his mind, I remained the villain who'd selfishly refused to complete my family obligations, and every subsequent problem in his life was somehow traceable back to my decision to stop funding his lifestyle. The idea that he might have been wrong, that his expectations might have been unrealistic, or that his behavior might have been entitled, never seemed to occur to him. This psychological inability to accept responsibility convinced me that I'd made the right choice, even during moments when I felt guilty about the dramatic consequences of my decision. Someone who could lose a college education, promising career prospects, and most of his family relationships over a luxury car demand, and still maintain that he was the victim, wasn't someone who would ever appreciate sacrifice or understand gratitude. He would have taken the Porsche, enjoyed it for a while, and then found something else to demand, confident that his emotional manipulation would work indefinitely. The car would have become just another baseline expectation, with future demands escalating accordingly. A house down payment, a business investment, travel funding for research trips, the requests would have continued and grown larger until eventually I would have been forced to draw a line somewhere. As for me, the year following our family implosion was transformative in ways I hadn't expected or anticipated. Without the constant drain of Jake's expenses and the psychological burden of managing his crises, I was able to invest seriously in expanding my marketing agency in directions I'd been considering for years. The financial freedom was immediate and dramatic. The money that had been flowing to Jake's various expenses, Tuition, rent, equipment, emergency funds suddenly became available for business investment. I hired 2 additional employees, both talented professionals I'd wanted to bring on board but couldn't afford while funding Jake's lifestyle. I secured several major contracts that required upfront investments in new software and equipment that I finally had the capital to purchase. Most significantly, I was able to move to a larger office space in a better part of town, something I'd been postponing for years because Jake's expenses took priority over my business needs. The new office space not only improved my company's professional image, but also allowed me to take on larger projects that required more workspace and equipment. More importantly than the financial benefits, I discovered what it felt like to live without the constant weight of other people's expectations and manufactured emergencies. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis call or planning my finances around someone else's needs and demands. The psychological relief was profound. I hadn't realized how much mental energy I'd been spending on Jake-related stress until it was suddenly gone. The constant background anxiety about when the next expensive emergency would arise, when the next desperate phone call would come asking me to solve another problem that Jake had created through his irresponsibility, all of that disappeared overnight. I could make decisions based solely on what was best for my business and personal life. A freedom I'd forgotten was possible after years of having my choices constrained by family obligations and guilt trips. When opportunities arose to attend industry conferences or invest in professional development, I could evaluate them based on their merit rather than whether I could afford them after covering Jake's latest crisis. I also began dating seriously for the first time in years, something that had been practically impossible when I was constantly financially and emotionally drained from managing Jake's manufactured emergencies. Previously, I'd always been too stressed about money to invest properly in relationships, and potential partners could sense the distraction and emotional unavailability that came with being someone's perpetual financial safety net. Now, with that burden lifted, I had the energy and emotional availability to build something meaningful with someone who appreciated effort rather than taking it for granted. I started seeing Michael, a fellow business owner who understood the challenges of building something from scratch and who respected boundaries rather than seeing success as an opportunity to make demands. The contrast was striking. Michael celebrated my achievements rather than viewing them as resources to be exploited. When I told him about my business expansion, his first reaction was pride in my success, not suggestions about how that success could benefit him. When I mentioned that I'd been able to afford some personal luxuries for the first time in years, he was happy for me rather than resentful that I wasn't sharing those luxuries with others. The money I saved by not buying Jake his Porsche, combined with the ongoing savings from not funding his lifestyle, became the down payment on my own dream car, a Tesla Model S that I'd been wanting for years, but couldn't justify while funding someone else's lifestyle and demands. Driving it felt like a daily reminder that I'd chosen self-respect over family manipulation, and I've never regretted that choice for even a moment. Every time I got behind the wheel, I was reminded of the decision that had changed my life. The moment I'd finally said no to an unreasonable demand and stuck to that boundary, despite intense pressure to cave in. The car wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of the shift in my life priorities. For once, I'd chosen myself over enabling someone else's entitlement. No guilt trips, no manipulation, no pretending it was for the greater good of family harmony. Just me finally giving myself something I'd earned and deserved. Occasionally, I still hear updates about Jake through the family grapevine, though the information becomes less frequent as time passes, and his situation remains largely unchanged. He's apparently found work at a small production company in Phoenix, doing basic editing work for commercial videos and local business advertisements. It's honest work, and it's actually exactly the kind of entry-level position he could have started with years ago if he'd been willing to build his skills gradually instead of expecting to begin at the top of the industry hierarchy. The irony isn't lost on anyone who knew about his Hollywood ambitions and his demands for luxury cars to make the right impression on industry professionals. According to Patricia's reports, Jake seems to have finally accepted that his film career isn't going to unfold the way he'd imagined, but he still hasn't accepted responsibility for the choices that led to his current circumstances. He continues to blame me for destroying his opportunities, though he's apparently stopped making these complaints publicly after the family dinner disaster. He's still working at that production company. Patricia told me during our most recent conversation, the work is basic, editing promotional videos for car dealerships and real estate companies, but at least he's employed consistently for the first time since he moved back. I think reality has finally hit him, even if he won't admit it. Sometimes I wonder if he's learned anything meaningful from the experience, if the humiliation and loss have taught him anything about gratitude, realistic expectations, or personal responsibility. But then I remember his dinner table speech about how I'd stolen his future, and I realize that some people are fundamentally incapable of accepting responsibility for their choices and their consequences. The family dynamics have settled into a new normal that feels much healthier for me, even if it's more distant than our previous relationships. I maintain contact with the relatives who supported my decision to establish boundaries, and I keep polite distance from those who didn't understand or criticize my choice. My parents and I exchange pleasantries at major holidays when we happen to attend the same gatherings, but the illusion that we're a close, supportive family has been permanently shattered. The conversations are cordial but surface level, focusing on safe topics like weather and work, rather than anything personal or meaningful. And honestly, I'm grateful for that clarity and emotional distance. The old family dynamic was built on the fundamental lie that my worth was measured by my willingness to sacrifice for Jake's benefit, that my success created obligations rather than opportunities, and that saying no to unreasonable demands was selfish rather than healthy. Now, with that lie exposed and rejected, I can build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The relatives who remained supportive understand that healthy families don't operate like ATMs, with successful members expected to fund everyone else's dreams and lifestyles without question or appreciation. Jake will probably always see me as the sister who destroyed his dreams by refusing to buy him a car when he demanded it as the price of admission to his graduation ceremony. In reality, I was the sister who gave him every possible advantage, more advantages than most people receive in a lifetime, and finally stopped enabling his refusal to grow up and accept adult responsibilities. He destroyed his own dreams through entitlement, manipulation, and the arrogant assumption that his success was someone else's responsibility to fund. I just stopped preventing him from experiencing the natural consequences of his choices and behavior. And as I sit in my Tesla, in the home I was finally able to buy for myself, running the expanded business I was able to build once I stopped funding someone else's fantasies, I know with absolute certainty that I made the right choice for my own life and well-being. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even if they'll never forgive you for it, and even if other people criticize you for not being supportive enough. Enabling entitled behavior isn't love. It's a form of harm that prevents people from developing the skills and character they need to build successful, independent lives. My brother wanted a Porsche as a graduation gift after I'd spent over $200,000 on his education and lifestyle. Instead of a car, he got something far more valuable but much less pleasant. A lesson in consequences that I should have given him years earlier. Whether he ever learns from that lesson isn't my responsibility anymore. I gave him every opportunity to succeed, more opportunities than most people get in their entire lives. What he does with the rest of his life is up to him. And that freedom from responsibility for someone else's choices and consequences, it turns out, is worth far more than any car could ever be.